Let me tell you where the word lynching really comes from, because the version that we were taught is a lie by omission, of course. Listen, everybody knows what lynching has become. The ropes, the trees, the mobs, the bodies left hanging as warnings, the terror that we inherited. But almost nobody ever learns where the word even came from. And once you learn that part, you understand something this country never says out loud. Lynching didn't start with murder. It started with permission. Permission for white men to punish whoever they wanted, however they wanted, whenever the legal system didn't give them the outcome that they preferred. So, let me tell you. During the Revolutionary War, Charles Lynch wasn't satisfied with the courts, so he built his own. He ran informal tribunals on his property. Not real courts, not real trials. He rounded up people suspected of supporting the British. Not proven guilty, not tried, not even properly questioned. Just suspected. And then he punished them. Whipping, imprisonment, forced labor, property seizure. All without a judge, without a jury, without evidence. People called it Lynch's Law, a nickname for punishment outside of the legal system. And here's the part that matters. He wrote to the Virginia legislature asking for protection. And instead of reprimanding him, they passed a law giving him and his men retroactive immunity. Think about that, right? America didn't just tolerate extra legal punishment. It validated it. That's the seed of the word lynching. And that seed grew into something that this country still hasn't reckoned with. In the 1780s, lynching didn't mean killing. It meant punishment without trial. It meant white men deciding that the law wasn't strict enough. It meant vigilante authority with government approval. By the 1830s, newspapers were using the word everywhere. But after the Civil War, when Black people were suddenly citizens on paper, that's when the word mutated. Lynch's Law went from punishing loyalists to punishing Black freedom. White mobs used it to justify terror, assaults, hangings, burnings, shootings, mutilation, public torture, all for things like voting, owning land, standing their ground, protecting their families, or simply existing outside of the bounds that white supremacy created. Lynching didn't become racial violence by accident, though. It became racial violence because the legal system allowed it to shift in that direction, and then refused to stop it. From 1882 to 1968, at least 3,442 Black people were lynched, not as punishment, as terror, as a message, as a warning to every Black person watching. And Congress blocked anti-lynching laws for over 120 years. They protected the word longer than they protected the people suffering under it. So here's the truth, the part they hoped you never connect. The word lynching didn't come from the violence. The violence came from the permission that was baked into that word from the start. A permission that said some people get due process. Other people get whatever the mob chooses. And America looked at Charles Lynch's backyard justice system and said, yeah, that works for us. So when you say the word lynching, know this. You're not just naming racial terror. You're naming a legal tradition. You're naming a philosophy that shaped this country. You're naming a system built on white men deciding that due process could be optional. So know where the word came from, know what it became, and know that this country never wanted you to connect the two.
Black people are being lynched in America. It's happening all over the South. And when law enforcement shows up and finds another black body hanging from a tree, they say, oh, it was a suicide. It's not suicide. It's white supremacists murdering black people. More specifically, it's white people murdering black people. In a Hollywood movie, you might hope to see the FBI show up, blanket the area with agents, track down the white supremacists, and bring justice to these murdered people. But Kash Patel, his FBI doesn't give a damn. And Donald Trump's Department of Justice? Well, not only do they not give a damn, they approve of it. So I just have one question for white people. How much longer are you going to let your silence about this make it continue? How much longer are you going to let this monstrosity in the White House murder innocent people, murder immigrants, murder citizens, murder black people, murder little girls in schools in Iran? How much longer?
The art of lynching is not a modern day term. is linked to a man whose foundations were embodied in self-inflicted judgment. And the sad part of it was that he was given backing by the state to carry out these extrajudicial killings and punishment. And that little double-headed hydra that became a beast that was untamed has grown to become a modern-day dragon. The abuse of the black people, the black community, has not in any way changed. While the world looks on at what transpired with the Noah Wells case as a point of reference, there has been over 20, or rather, I'm wrong, over 200 black people who have been killed in the South, most found hanging on a tree, and were ruled by the state-sponsored, health system and policemen on ground as suicide. How can you have that volume of people commit suicide? This is not the black way of life. We don't kill ourselves. We don't hang ourselves. And considering the fact that many of these bodies were found as high as you can imagine, sometimes 15, 20 feet from the earth, how did they get that far to do what they did, to commit that suicide? And that is what this entire video needs to explore and to investigate and to arouse a black consciousness of the reality that is happening. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Please feel free to follow me. Give me the thumbs up. Give me the like. Let's go straight back to the videos.
Pictures like this, and this have existed for decades. The practice of lynching in America has existed for 250 years. For almost 250 years, Black Americans have been the only ones fighting it. Between 1877 and 1968, white mobs lynched an estimated 4,000 Black Americans as a means of racial terror and intimidation. And by and large, white Americans were either doing the lynching, watching the lynching, or turning a blind eye to the lynching. Matter of fact, the first comprehensive anti-lynching campaign was led by a Black woman, Ida B. Wells. After her 3 friends were murdered in Memphis in 1892, she started to produce pamphlets that debunked the myths that lynching were for Black men committing crimes, and it was more so a means of racial intimidation. She traveled to Britain to talk about lynching. She produced a book that documented the history of lynching. She went to Washington, D.C. to tell President William McKinley that he needed to do something about lynching. Through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, Black people were the ones on the ground campaigning against one of the most heinous crimes that have ever been committed on this soil. And it took until 2022 for the United States government to finally do something about it.
White people often think of lynchings as something that happened in the dark of night when a few rogue characters whisk a Black person away and murder them. And maybe that's what's happening today in the lynchings that are occurring today. But historically in this country, I think we need to be aware of a different reality. Lynchings in American history of Black people have taken place in a ritualistic way. There's an order to it. And it looks like this. I'll illustrate with the case of Jesse Washington. Now, Jesse was a 17-year-old kid. He was a farm laborer in Waco, Texas. Texas was notorious for stuff like this. Here's the first part of the ritual. He was accused of murdering a white woman. Her name was Lucy Fryer, and she was his boss's wife. Well, he got a trial. It lasted about an hour, and the jury deliberated for just a couple minutes before they sentenced him to death. And what happened next is this pattern that happens throughout history in all these so-called spectacle lynchings. A crowd storms into the courtroom. They seized Washington and dragged him through town. Now, sometimes they break the guy out of jail. Sometimes they go to his home and drag him away. And then there's the audience. In the spectacle gatherings, there can be a big crowd. There were 5,000 to 10,000 people at Jesse Washington's murder, and they brought picnics. There were photographers. It was a party. So this was a community event that white people did to bolster white supremacy. Oh, good, we're going to have a lynching. And let's plan for that. We know what goes into a lynching. It's always the same. Let me bring in the point about this being a family affair. Businesses closed, schools let out, and children were an active part of the lynching scene. This creeps me the fuck out. Then comes a period of torture. It's rare for someone to immediately be hung to death. Usually there's torture first. In the case of Jesse Washington, this 17-year-old kid, he was hung by a chain over a tree, and then the chain was raised and lowered into a fire below his feet repeatedly for approximately 2 hours until he finally died. During this process, while he was still alive, he would occasionally try to pull himself out of the fire because his body was burning. Well, they didn't like this, so they cut off his fingers so that he could no longer pull himself out of the fire. Families posed for photographs. So after Mr. Washington died, people rushed up to the remains and cut away pieces of Mr. Washington's body as souvenirs. Children participated in the dismembering of the body. Boys pulled the teeth out of his skull to either sell or keep for souvenirs. Now, it is not easy to get the teeth out of a young adult in their prime. They had to use force. They had to have teamwork. And the children did this. Children stood over his burnt body and pried or broke teeth from his skull while adults watched. And then after it was all over, the photographers sold the pictures. They sold the pictures of the murder. It was a public ritual of racial terror that was witnessed, approved, and remembered apparently fondly by an entire community. Our culture, such as it is, devised a system of ritualized murder of black people. Those kids lived on, and they raised kids. A kid who participated in a lynching raised children, and those children grew up, and their children are alive now. So you can see how the ritual destroys the notion that this was just random crazy acts and supports the notion that this was a community event that was ritualized and valued. Religious leaders were often involved in the accusation and in the trial and participated in the lynchings. Get curious.
There is no past.
What do you mean?
There are cycles. If you go back to 1961, 62, 63, and you listen to some of our greats talk, they talk about economic opportunity.
Yep.
They talk about police brutality.
Yep.
They talk about the vote.
Yep.
They talk about talk about equality.
Right. The cycles, I get it.
We are talking about the same things.
Yeah. Same exact-
And the reason why we are still talking about them is because that past that we are talking about cannot be properly adjudicated until it is accepted as reality. See, here's the deal. Everything that America has asked Black people to do, to be equal participants in America, Black people have done it.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
So America said, go out and buy land. We went out and bought land. We own more land in 1905 than we own now. Right now, the top 5 landowners in this country own more land than all of Black Americans combined. You know, you got the, so go out and establish economic hubs and centers. Forget about everybody else.
We did that.
Like, go out and establish it for yourself. We did it.
In Tulsa.
They
came and
firebombed it from the sky.
Tulsa, yes. Yeah.
Not the Tulsa, the
Philly,
entire
even
Red
Philly.
Summit. Everywhere.
Yeah.
They said every time we've done it, white America said no.
Yep.
And when they couldn't get Tulsa with firebombs from the sky.
Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So whenever I'm teaching an American history course, the lynching of Black Americans is one of the darkest and most upsetting chapters that I cover. It's almost impossible to imagine or comprehend the level of depravity and violence that was involved in these killings. And I honestly believe that when you bring an accurate discussion of lynching into the American story, you'll never be able to look at American history the same again. In order to have a factual and accurate discussion of lynching with my students, I've spent years researching lynchings, and I've read hundreds of accounts of lynchings from historical newspaper databases, and I would like to share some of the conclusions I found from my research with you. So, lynching describes the illegal murder of Black Americans by white mobs. There was no justice, no judge, no jury, no trial. This was public murder. But what were the reasons that the lynchers gave for these killings? How did they justify themselves? What were the supposed crimes that these Black Americans were being killed for? Now, during the time period, the lynchers often made the false accusation that they were killing an individual because they had assaulted a white woman. However, anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells did her own research and found that this was completely false, and that in the majority of lynching cases, the only crime that the Black individual had committed was being Black in a white supremacist society. However, protecting white women continued to be a popular explanation for lynchings. For example, Caleb Gadley was lynched in Kentucky in 1894 for walking behind the wife of his white employer. Keith Bowen was lynched in Mississippi in 1889 for accidentally entering and then leaving a room where 3 white women were. General Lee was lynched in South Carolina in 1904 for knocking on the door of a white woman's house. Thomas Miles was lynched in 1912 for inviting a white woman to go have a drink with him. Jeff Brown was lynched in 1916 for accidentally bumping into a white girl as he ran to catch a train. Parks Banks was lynched in Mississippi in 1922 for having the picture of a white woman in his possession. In 1889 in Loudon, Virginia, a Black 14-year-old named Orion Anderson was lynched by a mob of white men. What was his crime? He was playing with a white girl and he put on a mask and he scared her, and he was killed for it. In 1930, John Wilkins was lynched for smiling at a white woman on a train. Sometimes lynchings were the result of a black American breaking some unwritten white supremacist rule. For example, Jesse Thornton was lynched in Alabama in 1949 for not saying Mr. as he talked to a white police officer. Some of the other reasons for lynchings were speaking disrespectfully to white people, arguing with a white person, insulting a white person, refusing to step off of the sidewalk to make way for a white person, or just standing around. It's clear that there never was any real crime associated with lynching. The crime that these people were being killed for was the crime of having black skin. So the next question becomes, who were the lynchers? And you might be surprised to learn that it was not racist terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Yes, those groups did kill black Americans, but they were not responsible for the majority of lynchings. So who were the lynchers? The lynchers were doctors, teachers, grocers, businessmen, lawyers, parents, children, police officers. It was the entire community that was participating in these killings. There was nowhere to turn for help. You couldn't go to the authorities because the police officers were participating in the lynching. You can see from this photograph, the caption reads, "Lynching in action. State troopers and citizens of Gordonsville, Virginia formed a posse of 1,000 which fired for 6 hours on the cabin of a 65-year-old Negro worker and his sister. They finally burned the hovel and both victims." It's ironic that when the bodies of lynching victims were brought to the morgue, they often wrote under cause of death, "death at the hands of persons unknown." But that is a complete lie. They knew exactly whose hands had done it because it was the entire community. Just look at these mugshots from individuals that were involved in a lynching in South Carolina in 1947. All of the men in this picture participated in that lynching, and not a single individual was charged with a crime. Here's another article from 1943. The headline reads, "These men might ordinarily pass for decent citizens. However, all of these individuals had recently taken part in a lynching." And when people were asked to describe what these men were like, here's what they said. "These are some of the best men in the county. Men who are considered here to be the best representatives in the community of law, order, and justice. They called these men good Christians. They called them the best citizens." The lynchers were not seen as monsters, but upstanding members of the community. They were not treated as pariahs or social outcasts because everyone in the community was participating in these killings. The next point to emphasize is that lynchings were not spontaneous acts of violence that were committed in a fit of rage. These were organized, planned events that were attended by thousands of people. Usually a lynching victim was kept for a few days, sometimes in a jail cell or held in another location, and this gave the lynchers time to advertise the event. You can see here from this newspaper ad, the date, the time, the location of lynchings was widely distributed in order for more people to come and participate in this killing. And sometimes people drove across state lines. They would travel hundreds of miles in order to watch these murders take place. Lynchings were usually held on weekends, so more people could attend. However, if they were held on a weekday, all of the businesses would close down so their employees could go watch the lynching, and all of the schools would also close down. They would ring the bells, and all of the students would walk out in a single file, and their teachers and parents would take them to these lynchings. And when they got there, they would hear musicians playing music, and they would find vendors selling snacks and drinks. Now, these lynchings were not done under the cover of dark in the middle of the woods. They were done in public, in broad daylight, in the middle of Main Street, on the public square, sometimes even on the courthouse lawn. Now, if you look at this photograph, you would never know that these people are going to a lynching. These individuals are flocking to go watch a public murder take place in broad daylight in America. If you look at this photograph, you would never know that what these individuals are all straining to see is a lynching, the killing of a Black American. If you were to look at this photograph with no context, it looks like a carnival or a concert, and that is exactly the type of atmosphere that lynchings had. People were not ashamed to take part and to watch these lynchings. These were nights that these individuals wanted to remember. That's why usually during all lynchings, there were professional photographers that were taking pictures of the killings and turning them into postcards. And they were also taking pictures of individuals that were there that wanted to commemorate and remember this night. If you look at this picture and you see the faces of these individuals, it's very hard to imagine that just right off the screen are 3 young Black teenagers that have been brutally killed. This is a picture of a lynching that took place in Florida in 1935. And this is a young girl watching an individual be killed right in front of her eyes. And I want you to look at her face and look at the smile on her face. The fact that a young girl could watch a Black American be brutally killed right in front of her and then smile while looking at that dead body shows you just how much Black Americans had been dehumanized. And it shows you how much white America was desensitized to this violence. To accurately tell the story of American history, this level of violence has to be brought back into the main narrative. We are never going to be able to move forward as a nation or a people until we finally deal with the legacy of this violence.
So welcome back, guys. Watching these videos make me feel very sad and moody at the same time. It tells me so much that the Black community, the FBAs, have survived and have suffered in the Americans. And I celebrate the Black community. I celebrate their resilience. And this is not intended to, stir up racial divides or hatred, but you can never take away the past of a person, because your past is all part of your future, and it determines who you are and allows you to be able to navigate the paths in the future. And so it is important that these stories be put out there so that everyone knows what is really happening in modern day lynching, that these killings that happened in the late 70s, 60s and 50s is still happening. It's happening in our very eyes in 2025, 2026 Mississippi, with over 200 cases of lynchings that have been tagged killing. So I want you to know what your thoughts, your opinions are in the comment section. Please hit the comment section, hit the notification buttons. Let the discussion begin in the comment section, and trust to see you again on my next video. Shalom.